Hi folks, so today's video is about transport in cells, and the three different processes of that are diffusion, osmosis and active transport. So if we look at diffusion, so I've got my lovely art skills on the go. So I've got a beaker of water. This is supposed to be before and after. So I've got a beaker of water, and let's say I add some food colouring or blackcurrant squash or whatever you want. So let's say I add a drop of blackcurrant squash here. So we've got the water there, we've got the blackcurrant squash there, and if we sit and we leave it and we watch what happens, and you can do this at home. You can get a glass of water and just add a tiny drop of food colouring and sit and just watch it, and then what happens is it gradually all spreads out, and so eventually you end up with a nice even spread. And you can speed that up by, if you just leave it on the side, you can actually sit and watch it happening slowly. You can speed it up by stirring it or by heating it up, because if you're stirring it or heating it up, you're making the particles all move around and you're mixing it up quicker and it spreads out quicker. So diffusion is when something spreads out. And the sort of scientific way of putting that, I'll just give you a second to read through this. So diffusion is the movement of particles from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration until the concentrations are equal. So a few keywords there. So concentration is how much stuff there is in a certain space. So if we're looking here, so there's a high concentration of these red particles, let's call it food current, high concentration here and a low concentration here. So what's going to happen is it's going to move from an area of high concentration to a low concentration, and then eventually we end up where the concentration is equal everywhere. So we've got just another example of this. If you, let's say, bird's eye view, so looking at top down of a room, I know, let's draw TV in the corner, and like a sofa over here. Weird sofa, and I know, an armchair in this corner. Right, if someone walks into this room and sprays a load of air freshener, so we've got a high concentration of air freshener here and a low concentration of air freshener over there, and then what happens, it moves from high concentration to low concentration, and eventually it ends up being equal concentration all over the room. And exactly the same way how like perfume or aftershave works, right? If you're wearing perfume, you've got a high concentration of perfume on you, and then it diffuses from an area of high concentration, so on you, to an area of low concentration, the rest of the room, until they're all equal. It's how particles spread out. So that's what diffusion is. Now, I'm going to look at the next one on our list, which is osmosis. So osmosis is the diffusion of water across a partially permeable membrane. So we need to remember what diffusion was. Diffusion was when something moved from high concentration to low concentration, and that's exactly what osmosis is. Osmosis is something moving from high to low, but it's a special type of diffusion because it is the diffusion of water, and it's across this partially permeable membrane. What does that mean? Well, partially means a bit. Permeable means something can pass through it. So if something is partially permeable, it means some things can pass through it, but not all things. So we've got an example of this. Let's get another whiteboard. So my example of this one, and this is an experiment that you should have seen in school. If not, I'd suggest looking it up on YouTube. So I'm going to get 3 cubes of potatoes. So I've got a little potato cube. Let's say they're all identical. So I've got my 3 potato cubes, and I get 3 beakers of water. And the important thing for this is the beakers of water aren't all identical. So this one is going to be 100% H2O. So just water. This one's going to be 80% H2O. And this one is going to be 50% H2O. And that's because this one is also going to have this one is also going to have 20%, and I'm running out of space to do it, but 20% glucose, so sugar, and this one's going to have 50% glucose. So what that means we end up with is, let's just add these in a little bit. Okay, so we chuck our potato cubes in, and what this whole experiment depends upon is the fact that these potato cubes contain water. Potatoes have got some water in it. So let's say I add in a few things of water in here. So our potato cubes have got water in them, which means when we chuck them in here, they've still got their water in them, right? And then, if you remember what diffusion was, so it's when things go from a high concentration to low concentration. We're not talking about diffusion at the moment, we are talking about osmosis, but osmosis was just diffusion for water. So we're looking at this, and there's a really high concentration of water in this beaker, and there's not a high concentration of water in the potato. So what happens is water goes from high to low, which means water enters the potato. So that potato cube will swell up and get bigger because water is going from high concentration in the beaker into the low concentration in the potato, makes that potato swell up. And if we look at this one, this is like a really syrupy, sugary mixture here. And actually the water here is quite a low concentration because of all the sugar and syrup in it, which means there's actually a higher concentration in the potato. And if we remember about osmosis, it goes from high to low, which means here in this one, the water is leaving the potato and going into the beaker. So if we compared these two potatoes, if we weighed them at the start, and let's say they were both 2 grams, if we weigh this one at the end, when we take it out, dry it off, dry the water off the outside of it, this potato might go from 2 grams to 4 grams. Let's say it's doubled in size because lots of water has entered it. This one might have started off at 2 grams. It might end up as only being 1 gram because lots of the water has left the potato and gone into the syrupy solution. And let's say for this one, where it's 80% water, 20% glucose, let's say for argument's sake, this one starts off at 2 grams and finishes at 2 grams. That means we know the concentration in the potato must be exactly the same as the concentration in the solution because water didn't diffuse in or diffuse out. So if water didn't diffuse in or diffuse out, it must mean that the concentrations were equal. So we can say that the concentration of water in there was, say, an 20% mixture. So going back to it, diffusion is the movement of any particle from high concentration to low concentration. Osmosis is a special case of diffusion. Osmosis is when water diffuses from high concentration to low concentration through a partially permeable membrane. So in this example, our partially permeable membrane was the cell walls of the potatoes. So those cell walls, those cell membranes of the potatoes, they will let some things flow in, some things flow out, but not all things. So they are partially permeable. So they let water in and out, but they don't let other things in and out. So we've done diffusion, done osmosis. So last one, active transport. So just give you a few seconds to read this one. So active transport is the opposite of the others. All the others were when something goes from high concentration to low concentration, like that air freshener spreading out or the drop of food colouring spreading out. Active transport is when it goes from low concentration to high concentration. That's where the active part comes from, because it requires energy. It doesn't happen ordinarily. If you don't put any energy in, you get exactly the opposite, and you get diffusion, where something goes from high to low. But if we want something to go from low to high, we have to put energy in. Hence, we are actively transporting something. So, as an example for this one, so we've got a beautiful tree, not an atomic bomb mushroom cloud. So we've got a tree, and we're going to zoom in on some of the roots of this tree. So we've got a tree in the soil, and we're going to look at some of these roots. So if we massively zoom in, and we're going to look at what's happening with the root growing into the soil. So we've got the tree root under the soil, and let's say, for argument's sake, the tree needs lots of minerals. So let's say the tree has got quite a high concentration of minerals. I don't know, I'm hoping this green colour shows up okay. The tree's got quite a high concentration of minerals in the root, and there's quite a low concentration of minerals in the soil. So if the tree did nothing and used no energy, what would happen is diffusion, and they would go from high concentration to low concentration, and they'd actually leave the tree, leave the root, and end up in the soil. But the tree doesn't want that to happen. The tree's being really greedy. Even though it's got lots of these minerals already, it wants these last few. So it's got to make them go from a low concentration to a high concentration. And so to do that, it uses active transport. It uses energy to actively transport these last bits of minerals out of the soil. So going back to the title slide, so diffusion, osmosis, active transport. You need to be able to commit to memory these definitions. So diffusion is something going from a substance going from high concentration to low concentration until the concentrations are equal. And then you need to have that one memorized to go on to this one, because osmosis is the diffusion of water across a partially permeable membrane. Remember, partially permeable means a little bit permeable. It lets some substances go through, but not all. And then active transport is the opposite to them all. Active transport requires energy, and it's transporting a substance from a low concentration to a high concentration. And the very last thing which I'm going to talk about, sometimes in questions about these, you hear something referred to a concentration gradient. Concentration gradient. So gradient, just like how steep a line is, just like you'd use it in maths. So if I draw a graph, so this is going from high concentration to low concentration. So if we talk about something going down a concentration gradient, that means it's going from high to low. It's going downhill. So that it would be diffusion or osmosis, because it's going from high to low. It moves down a concentration gradient. If you talk about moving something up a concentration gradient, because you want to move it from low to high, you're going uphill. It requires energy. That's why it's active transport. Okay, hope that makes sense.